At exactly 2:17 in the morning, he wasn't supposed to be home, but he was, and that's when he saw her. A pregnant maid standing on a chair reaching into a part of his house no one ever touched. Her hands were shaking, her wrist bruised, and when she turned and saw him, the look on her face wasn't fear. It was something far worse. It was recognition. Ethan Caldwell had spent most of his life building a world where nothing surprised him. Every door in his mansion opened with intention, every employee followed strict routines, and every moment of his day was accounted for with precision that bordered on obsession. He believed control was the only thing that kept a man safe in a world where trust could cost everything. That belief had made him powerful, untouchable even, a man whose name carried weight in rooms he had never stepped into. But as he stood there in that quiet hallway, staring at a woman who clearly did not belong in that moment, he felt something unfamiliar press against his chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't confusion. It was a quiet, creeping sense that something had slipped through the cracks of his perfect system, something that had been there longer than he realized. The house, which usually felt like a fortress, suddenly felt exposed, like it was holding onto secrets it had never shared with him. The woman stepped down slowly, her movements careful, as if each inch of motion carried weight. She avoided his eyes, not in the way employees usually did out of respect, but in a way that felt deliberate, almost protective. Ethan noticed the cleaning supplies beside her, the faint smell of polish lingering in the air, but none of it explained why she had been reaching into a section of the bookshelf that hadn't been touched in years. That shelf wasn't decorative. It was sealed off behind custom panels, a part of the house designed for privacy. Very few people even knew it existed. Yet here she was, not only aware of it but comfortable enough to approach it in the middle of the night. His instincts told him to question her immediately, to demand answers the way he always did, but something held him back. Instead, he simply watched her, trying to understand what he had just walked into and why it felt like he was the one intruding. She finally looked up, and for a brief second their eyes met. There was no panic in hers, no rush to explain or defend herself. Instead, there was something steady, something that suggested she had expected this moment, or at least wasn't entirely surprised by it. Ethan had spent years reading people, studying the smallest shifts in expression to understand their intentions before they spoke, but this was different. He couldn't read her. That unsettled him more than anything else. "I'll finish and leave," she said quietly, her voice even, almost detached. It wasn't a request or an apology, it was a statement. And without waiting for his response, she turned slightly, as if to continue what she had been doing before he arrived. That was when Ethan realized something that didn't sit well with him at all. She wasn't afraid of him. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Ethan didn't move for a moment after she spoke. He simply stood there, letting the silence stretch, trying to decide whether to assert control or observe further. In the end, he chose something he rarely allowed himself to do. He stepped back. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the hallway. It wasn't weakness that made him do it. It was calculation. Because if there was one thing Ethan understood better than anyone, it was that the most valuable answers often came when people believed they weren't being watched. And as he walked down that long corridor, he made a quiet decision. He was going to find out who she really was, how she had found that hidden section of his house, and why the look in her eyes felt like it carried a history he couldn't remember. The next morning, everything appeared normal. Staff moved through their routines, the house echoed with its usual calm, and there was no visible sign of what had happened just hours earlier. But Ethan didn't rely on appearances. He went straight to his office, closed the door, and pulled up the internal staff records. Her name was listed as Claire Bennett, hired 3 months ago through a third-party agency. Background verified. References checked. On paper, there was nothing unusual about her. But Ethan had built his empire on one principle. When something feels wrong, it usually is. So he kept digging. He cross-checked the agency's records, then the references, then the employment history. Each step led to something that looked real on the surface but lacked depth upon closer inspection. Addresses that existed but had no connection to her. Phone numbers that led nowhere. Employers who had no record of her working for them. It was as if someone had constructed a life for her, piece by piece, just convincing enough to pass initial checks but hollow underneath. By midday, Ethan knew one thing for certain. Claire Bennett wasn't who she claimed to be. That realization didn't make him angry, it made him focused. Because people didn't go through that level of effort without a reason, and whatever her reason was, it had something to do with him. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen, replaying the moment from the night before in his mind. The way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she looked at him. There was no hesitation in her actions, no sign of someone caught doing something they shouldn't be doing. Instead, there was intention. That meant she hadn't stumbled onto that hidden shelf by accident. She had gone there for a purpose. And if she knew about that part of the house, then there was a chance she knew about other things too. Things that were never meant to be seen. That night Ethan didn't go home late. He made sure of it. He kept his schedule the same, left at the usual time, and allowed the house to settle into its routine. But instead of staying away, he returned quietly, entering through a side access point that bypassed the main security alerts. It was something only he knew how to do, a failsafe he had installed years ago for moments when he needed to observe without being detected. The house was silent when he stepped inside. Lights dimmed, hallways empty. Everything exactly as it should be. He moved slowly, carefully, positioning himself where he had a clear view of the corridor from the night before without being seen. And then he waited. Time passed in stillness. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, each second sharpening his focus. Then, just as the clock edged closer to that same time, he heard it. Soft footsteps, measured, unhurried. She appeared again just as she had the night before, moving with that same quiet confidence. There was no hesitation in her steps, no sign that she suspected she was being watched. She went straight to the bookshelf, reached for the same hidden section, and this time Ethan leaned forward slightly, watching more closely than before. Her hands didn't just search randomly. They followed a pattern, pressing specific points, tracing edges as if she knew exactly where to look. That confirmed what he had begun to suspect. She wasn't guessing. She was looking for something she believed was there. And then something changed. Her movement slowed. Her shoulders dropped slightly, and for the first time she looked unsure. She pressed one section again, harder this time, as if willing it to respond. When nothing happened, she stepped back, placing a hand on her stomach, her expression tightening in a way that suggested more than frustration. It looked like disappointment. That was when Ethan realized something else. Whatever she was searching for, she hadn't found it yet, and that meant she would keep coming back. That meant this wasn't over, it was just beginning. Ethan Vance built his life on control. Every deal calculated, every person replaceable, every emotion buried. His mansion wasn't just a home, it was a system. Staff worked in silence. Cameras watched everything. Nothing happened without him knowing. At least that's what he believed. Until that night. Because at exactly 2:17 in the morning, when he wasn't supposed to be home, the system failed him for the first time in years, and it failed him in a way he couldn't explain. The image stayed with him long after he walked away. The pregnant maid standing on that chair, reaching into a place no one ever touched, her wrist bruised, her hands shaking, and that look in her eyes when she turned toward him. It wasn't fear. It wasn't confusion. It was recognition. And Ethan Vance was not a man who forgot faces, yet he could not place hers. And that unsettled him more than anything else. By morning, Ethan returned to his routine with the same precision that had defined his entire life, but something had shifted beneath the surface. He sat in his office overlooking the city, reviewing reports, signing documents, taking calls that moved millions with a single decision, yet his mind kept drifting back to that hallway. To her. To the fact that someone like her, quiet, unnoticed, invisible by design, had found her way into a part of his house that had been deliberately hidden. That section of the bookshelf wasn't decorative. It had been installed years ago, custom-built, sealed, and known only to him and one other person he trusted at the time. No staff member had access to it. No blueprint showed it. No camera pointed directly at it. And yet she had gone straight to it as if she had been there before. That wasn't an accident. That wasn't curiosity. That was intention. He pulled up the internal staff database again, staring at the name listed on the screen, Lila Moreno. The same name he had seen the night before. The same identity that now felt incomplete, like a story missing its beginning. Everything about her profile looked clean at first glance. Too clean. Verified documents, consistent employment history, no incidents, no complaints. It was the kind of record that passed through systems without raising a single question. But Ethan didn't rely on systems. He relied on patterns, and her pattern didn't fit. 3 months of employment, yet no one seemed to remember the exact day she started. Assigned to late shifts more often than anyone else, yet never requested them. Minimal interaction with other staff, yet no reports of isolation. She existed within the system, but she wasn't part of it, and that made her dangerous. The memory of her wrist surfaced again, the bruises shaped too precisely to ignore. Not random, not accidental. They looked like fingers had pressed into her skin and stayed there long enough to leave a mark that would last days, maybe longer. Ethan had seen injuries like that before, though not in his home. It raised questions he didn't like asking, questions that pulled him away from the controlled world he had built for himself. Who had done that to her? And why was she still here, working in silence, moving through his house at hours when no one else was around? The more he thought about it, the less it made sense. And Ethan Vance did not tolerate things that didn't make sense. That evening, he changed nothing about his schedule. He left the house at the usual time, gave the usual instructions, maintained the appearance of normalcy that everyone around him expected. But beneath that routine, he made a quiet adjustment. He activated a secondary surveillance system, one that bypassed the main network entirely. Cameras that weren't listed in any official record, angles that covered the blind spots, including the hallway, including the bookshelf. If Lila Moreno returned to that spot again, he would know, and this time he wouldn't walk away. Hours passed. The house settled into its usual silence. Staff finished their duties and disappeared into their assigned quarters or left the property altogether. The lights dimmed, the security systems locked into place, and everything appeared exactly as it should. But Ethan wasn't watching the house as a whole anymore. He was watching one corridor, one moment, one person. And when the clock moved closer to that same time, 2:17 in the morning, his attention sharpened. Because something inside him was certain of one thing: she would come back. And she did. Lila Moreno appeared in the frame with the same quiet presence, moving through the hallway like she belonged there, like she had done it 100 times before. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look around. She went straight to the bookshelf, stepped onto the same chair, and reached for the same hidden section. Her hands moved with familiarity, tracing edges, pressing points that weren't visible to anyone who didn't know what they were doing. Ethan leaned forward slightly, watching every detail, every movement, every second. And then he saw it again, the tremor in her hands, the tension in her shoulders, the way she paused just for a moment before continuing. She wasn't just searching, she was struggling. And then she stopped. Her hand rested against the panel, unmoving. Her head lowered slightly, and for a brief second, the strength she had carried into that moment seemed to fade. She placed her other hand against her stomach, steadying herself, breathing carefully as if the effort of standing there was heavier than it should have been. The bruises on her wrist were clearer now under the camera's angle, darker than before, as if they hadn't begun to heal at all. Ethan felt something shift again, something he hadn't expected to feel when this started. It wasn't suspicion. It wasn't anger. It was something closer to concern, though he wouldn't have called it that. But concern didn't answer questions. And Ethan Vance needed answers. Because the system he built was designed to prevent exactly this: unknown variables, unseen movements, unanswered questions. And yet here she was, standing in the middle of it, breaking rules he didn't even realize could be broken. And the most unsettling part of all wasn't what she was doing. It was the feeling that she wasn't the only one who knew how to do it. The hallway lights were dim, the house unusually quiet, and there she was, balanced on a wooden step stool, her uniform stretched tight over her stomach, too pregnant to be working this late, too tired to even pretend she wasn't struggling. Ethan noticed three things immediately: the bruises, the silence, and the fact that she didn't apologize, not even when she saw him. In his world, people reacted the moment he appeared. They adjusted, straightened, explained themselves before he even had to ask. But Lila Moreno didn't. She simply looked at him, steady and unreadable, as if his presence hadn't disrupted her at all. That alone was enough to hold his attention because it broke a pattern he had relied on for years. And then there was the detail he couldn't ignore, the one that stayed with him long after that moment ended. Her wrist. The marks were clearer up close, shaped like fingers that had pressed hard enough to leave a memory in her skin. They weren't fresh, but they weren't fatting either. Whoever had done that hadn't been gentle, and whatever had happened hadn't been a single moment. It was the kind of detail Ethan usually dismissed as irrelevant, but something about the way she carried it made it impossible to overlook. She climbed down slowly, one hand gripping the edge of the shelf for balance, the other resting briefly against her stomach as if to steady both herself and the weight she carried. For a second, Ethan thought she might say something more, offer an explanation, an excuse, anything that would place this moment back into a structure he could understand. But she didn't. "I'll finish and leave," she said quietly, her voice controlled, almost measured. It wasn't nervous. It wasn't rushed. It sounded like someone who had already decided what would happen next, regardless of his response. That was when Ethan noticed something else, something that unsettled him more than the bruises or the silence. She wasn't afraid of losing her job. She wasn't afraid of him, and for someone in her position, that didn't make sense. Fear was a constant in environments like this. It kept people careful. It kept them obedient. But Lila Moreno stood there, as if those rules didn't apply to her, as if she had stepped into his world with a different set of expectations entirely. Ethan took a single step closer, the sound of his shoe against the polished floor echoing softly in the empty hallway. It was enough to close the distance between them, enough for him to see the faint strain in her expression that she was trying to hide. Up close, the signs of exhaustion were impossible to ignore. The slight tremble in her hands, the way her shoulders carried tension even when she stood still, the careful way she shifted her weight to avoid discomfort. And yet, despite all of that, there was a steadiness in her gaze when she met his again. Not defiance, not challenge. Something quieter, something that suggested she was measuring him in the same way he was measuring her. That realization didn't sit well with him. Ethan Vance was used to being the one who observed, the one who decided what mattered and what didn't. But in that moment, it felt like the roles had shifted in a way he couldn't control. His eyes moved briefly to the section of the bookshelf she had been reaching for, the part of the wall that appeared ordinary to anyone who didn't know what it concealed. The panel was flush with the rest of the structure, seamless, designed to disappear into the room without drawing attention. It had been years since he had last opened it, years since it had held any relevance to his life. And yet here she was, standing in front of it at 2:17 in the morning, as if it still mattered, as if it contained something worth finding. That was the detail that lingered the longest. Not her presence, not even the bruises, but the fact that she had gone straight to that exact spot without hesitation. It meant she knew something. And if she knew something, then the question wasn't whether she belonged there. The question was how long she had been moving through his house in ways he hadn't noticed. "Why that shelf?" he asked finally, his voice calm, controlled, giving nothing away. It was a simple question, but it carried weight. In his world, questions were rarely just questions. They were tests, openings, ways to see how people responded under pressure. Lila Moreno didn't answer immediately. She glanced at the shelf, then back at him as if considering how much to say. That pause, brief as it was, told Ethan more than any quick response could have. She was choosing her words carefully. Not out of fear, but out of intention. "It needed cleaning," she said at last. The answer was technically correct, but it wasn't the truth. He could hear that in the way she said it, in the slight distance between her words and what she actually meant. It was the kind of answer people gave when they wanted to close a conversation without revealing anything more. Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer, letting the silence stretch between them. Most people filled silence quickly, offering more than they intended just to escape it, but she didn't. She stood there, steady, waiting, as if she understood exactly what he was doing and refused to give him the reaction he expected. That alone confirmed what he had already begun to suspect. Lila Moreno was not just another employee. She didn't follow the usual patterns. She didn't respond the usual way. And most importantly, she didn't seem surprised to be standing in front of him in the middle of the night, in a place she wasn't supposed to be. That meant this moment wasn't an accident. It meant she had been prepared for it, or at least prepared for the possibility. After a few seconds, Ethan stepped back. It wasn't a retreat, it was a decision. Because pushing further in that moment wouldn't give him what he wanted. It would only force her to close off completely, to retreat into whatever version of herself she presented to the rest of the staff. And Ethan wasn't interested in that version. He was interested in the one standing in front of him now, the one who knew about the hidden shelf, the one who carried bruises she didn't explain, the one who looked at him with recognition instead of fear. So he did something he rarely did. He let the moment end without resolution, without answers, without control. And as he turned and walked away, leaving her in that dimly lit hallway, one thought stayed with him, sharp and persistent. Whatever had brought Lila Moreno into his house, into that exact place at exactly 2:17 in the morning, it wasn't random. And whatever she was looking for, she hadn't found it yet. She climbed down slowly, avoiding eye contact. "I'll finish and leave," she said softly. Her voice was calm, too calm. Ethan didn't respond, but something inside him shifted. Because for the first time in years he felt uncertain. It wasn't the kind of uncertainty that came from lack of information. It was deeper than that, quieter, harder to define. It came from the realization that something was happening in his own house that didn't follow his rules, something that existed outside the system he trusted more than people. And standing in front of him was the center of it, Lila Moreno, the same woman he had seen at exactly 2:17 in the morning, standing on that chair, reaching into a hidden part of his home as if it belonged to her. The same woman who looked at him not with fear, but with recognition, as if she had been expecting him all along. Ethan watched her for a moment longer, studying the small details that most people would overlook. The way she shifted her weight slightly to ease the strain on her body. The controlled rhythm of her breathing, careful, measured, as if she was used to managing discomfort without showing it. The faint hesitation in her movements, not from confusion but from calculation. She wasn't reacting to him. She was adjusting to him. That difference mattered more than anything she could have said. Because people who reacted were predictable. People who adjusted were not. And Ethan Vance built his entire life around predictability. It was how he stayed ahead. It was how he avoided mistakes. Yet here he was, standing in front of someone he couldn't map, someone who didn't fit into any category he understood. His gaze drifted again, almost involuntarily, to her wrist. The bruises stood out under the soft hallway lighting, darker now that he was closer, more defined than they had seemed at a distance. They weren't random marks. They were precise, almost deliberate, the kind left by a grip that had lasted longer than it should have. Ethan had seen enough of the world to recognize that kind of pressure. It suggested control, force, a moment where someone else had decided how far things would go. The question that followed came without effort. Who had done that to her? And why hadn't she done anything about it? But even as the thought formed, another one replaced it, sharper, more immediate. Why was she still here in his house in the middle of the night, focused on a hidden shelf instead of whatever had caused those marks? She turned slightly as if to return to her work, but the movement wasn't as smooth as before. There was a brief pause, a subtle break in her rhythm, and Ethan caught it. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there. The kind of hesitation that only showed up when someone was aware of being watched, even if they pretended not to be. That told him something important. She knew he was still there, still observing, still trying to understand. And yet she didn't rush. She didn't make excuses. She didn't leave. She continued, as if finishing what she started mattered more than avoiding whatever might come next. That choice didn't align with fear. It aligned with purpose. Ethan took a slow breath, his mind already moving ahead, connecting details, building a picture that was still incomplete but impossible to ignore. Lila Moreno wasn't just working late. She wasn't just cleaning. She was returning to the same place at the same time with the same focus. And she had done it enough times to move through the space without hesitation. That meant this wasn't her first night. It wasn't even her second. This had been happening repeatedly, quietly, right under the structure he believed was flawless. The realization settled in with a weight he couldn't dismiss. If she had been able to do this unnoticed, then the problem wasn't just her. The problem was the system itself. For the first time in a long time, Ethan didn't immediately act. He didn't question her further. He didn't call security. He didn't assert control in the way he always had. Instead, he stood there, letting the silence stretch, letting the moment reveal what it could without forcing it. Because something told him that pushing too hard, too fast, would close whatever space had opened between them. And right now, that space was the only place where the truth might exist. Lila Moreno adjusted her grip on the cleaning cloth, her fingers tightening slightly before relaxing again, and for a brief second, Ethan noticed something he hadn't seen before. Not fear, not weakness, something closer to restraint, as if she was holding something back, something she wasn't ready to reveal. That was when the unease settled fully. Not as a passing thought, but as something steady, something that stayed with him even as the moment began to fade. Because whatever was happening didn't start that night. It didn't begin at 2:17 in the morning, and it wasn't going to end with a simple explanation. Lila Moreno was part of something larger, something that connected to that hidden shelf, to the bruises on her wrist, to the way she looked at him like she knew him even when he didn't know her. And as Ethan Vance stood there in that dim hallway, watching her continue as if nothing had happened, one realization became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just an interruption in his control. It was the beginning of something he had no control over at all. The next day he checked the records. Her name, Lila Moreno, no emergency contact, no background history beyond 6 months. That didn't make sense. No one enters his world without a past, so he dug deeper, and what he found didn't exist. At first it looked like a technical issue, the kind of minor error that systems corrected automatically. Missing links, incomplete files. But the more Ethan Vance searched, the clearer it became that this wasn't an error. It was absence. The kind of absence that had been constructed carefully, piece by piece, until it looked complete on the surface but collapsed the moment you tried to verify it. Addresses led to empty properties. Phone numbers connected to lines that had never been registered. References pointed to people who could not be found. It wasn't just that Lila Moreno had no past. It was that someone had taken the time to make sure it couldn't be traced. Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen, the glow reflecting faintly in his eyes as he replayed the moment from 2:17 in the morning. The chair, the hidden shelf, the bruises on her wrist, and that look, recognition. It returned to him again, sharper now, harder to dismiss. People didn't look at strangers that way. That look belonged to someone who knew something, someone who had already connected pieces that he hadn't even realized were missing. That meant her presence in his house wasn't random. It wasn't opportunity. It was intention. And if it was intentional, then it had a purpose. The question was whether that purpose was about the shelf or about him. He opened another file, this time bypassing the standard system entirely. Internal archives, old property records, staff access logs going back years. If Lila Moreno had been inside his house before those 6 months, there would be something, a trace, a mistake. But the deeper he went, the more consistent the pattern became. Nothing, not a single entry that connected her to his world before that point. It was as if she had stepped into existence the day she was hired, fully formed, fully documented, yet completely untraceable. That kind of precision didn't happen by accident. It required planning, resources, time. And that meant one thing Ethan couldn't ignore. She wasn't alone in this. His attention shifted to the hearing agency listed on her file. On the surface, it appeared legitimate, registered, active, with a history of supplying domestic staff to high-profile clients. But when Ethan ran a deeper check, the structure began to unravel. The company existed, but its ownership was layered behind multiple entities, each leading to another, each designed to slow down anyone trying to follow the trail. It wasn't impossible to trace, but it wasn't simple either. And for a moment, Ethan paused, considering what that meant. Someone had gone to significant lengths to place Lila Moreno inside his house. Not just anywhere, but in a position that allowed her access during the quietest hours, the hours when even the most secure systems relied on routine rather than vigilance. He stood up and walked toward the window, looking out over the city without really seeing it. His mind was elsewhere, back in that hallway, back at that exact moment when everything shifted. The more he thought about it, the less it felt like a single event and the more it felt like a pattern he had failed to notice. She hadn't hesitated when she reached for that hidden shelf. She hadn't searched blindly. Her hands had moved with familiarity, pressing in places that required knowledge, not guesswork. That meant she knew what was behind it, or at least she believed she did. And if she believed something was there, then at some point someone had told her, or she had seen it herself. Ethan returned to his desk, his focus narrowing again. If her past couldn't be found through records, then it had to be reconstructed through behavior, patterns, movements, timing. He pulled up the internal camera logs, not just from the previous night, but from the past several weeks. Hours of footage condensed into sequences, each one showing the same thing. Lila Moreno moving through the house with quiet efficiency, blending into the background, unnoticed by everyone else, except for one detail. At exactly the same time, too, 17 in the morning, her routine changed. She always found her way to that hallway, always stopped at that shelf, always reached for the same hidden section, and every time she left without finding what she was looking for. That repetition mattered. It meant she was following something, a memory, an instruction, or a belief that something important was hidden there. And it also meant she hadn't succeeded. Not yet. Ethan's eyes lingered on the footage of her pausing, her hand resting against the panel, her shoulders tightening slightly before she stepped back. There was frustration there, not visible to anyone who wasn't looking for it, but clear to him. She expected something to happen when she touched that shelf. Something that hadn't happened. That meant whatever she knew was incomplete, and that gave Ethan an advantage. But as that thought settled, another followed, quieter but harder to ignore. If her knowledge was incomplete, then someone had given it to her. Someone who knew enough to point her in the right direction, but not enough to give her the full picture. Or someone who had chosen not to. And that raised a question Ethan couldn't dismiss. Was Lila Moreno searching for something on her own, or was she being used to find it for someone else? The answer to that question would determine everything that came next. He closed the file slowly, his decision already forming. This wasn't something he could solve from behind a screen. Records had limits. Systems had blind spots. But people revealed things when they believed they were close to what they wanted. And Lila Moreno was getting closer. Every night at 2:17, she returned to that same spot, driven by something strong enough to ignore fear, strong enough to keep her coming back despite failure. That kind of persistence didn't come from curiosity. It came from need. And need made people predictable, even when everything else about them was not. Ethan Vance reached for his phone, then stopped, his hand hovering for a moment before pulling back. No calls, no alerts, no interference, not yet, because whatever this was, it hadn't reached its end. It was still unfolding, still revealing itself piece by piece. And if he moved too soon, he risked losing the one thing he didn't have yet, the truth. So instead, he chose to wait, to watch. To let Lila Moreno return again at the same time to the same place, reaching for the same hidden shelf she believed held something important. Because the next time she did, Ethan wouldn't just be observing from a distance. The next time he would be there, at exactly 2:17 in the morning, ready to see what she did when she believed no one was watching. Security footage, 2:00 a.m., Every night she wasn't just cleaning, she was searching, same shelves, same corner, same exact spot, over and over again. Like she was looking for something very specific. Ethan Vance sat in silence as the footage played in front of him, not once, not twice, but repeatedly, each clip confirming what he had already begun to suspect. This wasn't random behavior. It wasn't curiosity. It was routine. The kind of routine built on certainty, not guesswork. Lila Moreno moved through the hallway with the same quiet precision every night, arriving at nearly the same minute, positioning the same wooden chair beneath the same section of the bookshelf, and reaching into that hidden space with movements that suggested familiarity. She wasn't discovering anything new. She was trying to access something she believed was already there. Ethan leaned forward slightly, narrowing his focus on the smallest details, the ones most people would overlook. The way her fingers pressed against the panel, not randomly but in sequence. The pause that followed as if she expected a response. The shift in her expression when nothing happened. It was subtle, but it was there. Disappointment, not confusion. That distinction mattered. Confusion came from uncertainty. Disappointment came from expectation. And expectation meant she had reason to believe that hidden section of his house contained something important. Something worth returning for, night after night, despite never finding it. That level of persistence didn't come from simple intent. It came from something deeper, something personal. The timestamp caught his attention next. 2:00 a.m. Not exactly 2:17, but close enough to matter. Close enough to suggest that the night he saw her hadn't been the first time. It had only been the first time he noticed. That realization settled heavily. For weeks, maybe months, Lila Moreno had been moving through his house at that hour, repeating the same action, standing in that same spot, reaching into that same hidden space. And he hadn't seen it. The system hadn't flagged it. The cameras had recorded it, but no one had been watching closely enough to understand what it meant. That wasn't just a flaw. It was a blind spot. And Ethan Vance did not tolerate blind spots. He replayed one particular clip again, slowing it down this time. Lila stepping onto the chair, steadying herself despite the strain on her body, her hand briefly resting against her stomach before reaching forward. The bruises on her wrist were visible even in the grainy footage, darker under the low light, unchanged from the night he saw them in person. That detail stayed with him longer than the rest, because it didn't connect to the shelf. It didn't connect to the system. It connected to her, to something outside his house. And yet, whatever that was, it hadn't stopped her from coming back. That meant whatever she was searching for mattered more than the pain she was carrying. Ethan stood up slowly, his mind already moving ahead of the footage, piecing together what the images alone couldn't explain. If Lila Moreno was searching for something hidden inside that shelf, then at some point someone had told her it existed, or she had seen it herself. But the design of that panel made accidental discovery almost impossible. It wasn't something a cleaner would stumble upon. It required knowledge, specific knowledge. And that brought him back to a possibility he hadn't fully considered before. That hidden section of the house had only ever been known to two people, himself and one other person from years ago, someone who no longer had any connection to his life, someone who shouldn't have had any connection to her. The thought lingered, uncomfortable but impossible to ignore, because if that connection existed, then this wasn't just about a maid searching for something she didn't understand. This was about information that had moved from one place to another quietly over time, until it reached someone who was now standing in his hallway at 2:17 in the morning, reaching into a space she had no reason to know about. And if that information had traveled once, it could have traveled again. Which meant Lila Moreno might not be the only one looking. He turned his attention back to the screen, letting the footage continue as he watched her step down from the chair once more. The pattern repeated itself exactly as before. The same pause, the same stillness, the same moment where she seemed to realize that whatever she expected to find wasn't there. But this time, Ethan noticed something else, something smaller. As she stepped down, her hand brushed against the edge of the shelf, and for a fraction of a second, her fingers lingered there, as if she was remembering something, or waiting for something that wasn't happening. It was a brief moment, easy to miss, but it changed everything. Because that wasn't the action of someone searching blindly. That was the action of someone who knew she was close. And as that realization settled, one thought became impossible for Ethan Vance to ignore. Whatever Lila Moreno was looking for inside that hidden section of his house, it wasn't just important to her. It was something she believed she was meant to find. Then came the call from his lawyer. "There's a problem," the man said. "Someone is reopening a case." Ethan frowned. "What case?" Silence. Then the fire. His heart stopped. For a moment the room felt smaller, like the walls had moved in just enough to make breathing harder than it should have been. Ethan didn't speak immediately. He didn't need to. The word alone was enough. The fire. It wasn't just a case. It was a chapter of his life he had sealed off completely, buried beneath years of success, distance, and deliberate silence. It had never followed him into the world he built afterward, until now. He stood still, the phone pressed against his ear, his mind already moving back to a time he rarely allowed himself to revisit. The details returned with a clarity that unsettled him. The building, the night, the reports that followed. It had been ruled an accident, a structural failure triggered by electrical faults. That was the official version, the one that closed the investigation, the one that allowed everything to move forward without resistance. Ethan had accepted that outcome without question because at the time it worked in his favor. It removed obstacles, cleared paths, opened doors that had previously been out of reach. And in his world, outcomes mattered more than origins, or at least that's what he had told himself. "Who's reopening it?" Ethan asked finally, his voice controlled, giving nothing away. On the other end there was a pause, longer this time, as if the answer carried more weight than the question itself. "That's the problem," the lawyer replied. "We don't know. The request didn't come through any official channel we recognize. It's quiet, but it's real." Ethan's grip on the phone tightened slightly, his attention sharpening. Quiet investigations were the most dangerous. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't follow predictable timelines. They moved in the background, gathering information until there was enough to act. And by the time they surfaced, it was usually too late to control the outcome. His thoughts shifted instantly, connecting pieces that had previously seemed unrelated. Lila Moreno, the hidden shelf, the repeated visits at 2:00 a.m., the bruises on her wrist, and that look at 2:17, the one that wasn't fear but recognition. It came back stronger now, harder to ignore, because recognition didn't come from nowhere. It came from knowledge, from history, from something that existed before that moment. And if the fire was being reopened now, after all this time, then the timing wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. Not with her already inside his house, already searching for something hidden, something she believed was important enough to risk everything for. "When did this start?" Ethan asked, his voice quieter now, more focused. "A few days ago," the lawyer said, "but the groundwork had to begin earlier. Someone been digging into this for a while." A while, the word settled heavily, because a while meant planning, it meant patience. It meant someone had been moving carefully, building something piece by piece until it was strong enough to surface. And if that was true, then Lila Moreno wasn't just part of the situation. She was part of the process. Whether she knew it or not. Ethan ended the call without another word, lowering the phone slowly as his mind continued to move. He walked toward the window again, looking out over the city, but this time he wasn't thinking about control or systems or business. He was thinking about the past, about a night that had been reduced to reports and conclusions, filed away and forgotten. But now it was back, not as a memory but as something active, something that was reaching into his present through unexpected paths. Through a woman who had no past beyond 6 months, through a hidden shelf she had no reason to know about, through a pattern of behavior that pointed to something larger than a simple search. His gaze hardened slightly as another thought formed, sharper than the rest. If the fire was being reopened, then someone believed there was more to it than what had been recorded, more than what had been accepted. And if that was true, then whatever they were looking for might not be in official records. It might not be in documents or reports or statements. It might be somewhere else, somewhere hidden, somewhere that had been overlooked or deliberately concealed. And suddenly, the image of Lila Moreno standing on that chair, reaching into that exact section of the bookshelf at 2:17 in the morning, took on a different meaning. What if she wasn't just searching randomly? What if she was looking for something connected to the fire? The idea settled in with a quiet certainty that made it impossible to dismiss, because the shelf wasn't just hidden. It had been designed to keep things out of sight, out of reach, out of records. And if something had been placed there years ago, something tied to that night, something that never made it into the official story, then it would still be there, waiting, until someone who knew enough came looking for it. And Lila Moreno had been looking, every night, at the same time, in the same place, with the same determination. Ethan turned away from the window, his decision forming with clarity now. This was no longer just about a breach in his system. It was no longer just about a woman with no past searching for something she shouldn't know existed. This was connected. The fire, the investigation, the hidden shelf, and Lila Moreno standing in his hallway at 2:17 in the morning, reaching for something she believed was important enough to risk everything. The question was no longer whether she would come back. The question was what would happen when she finally found what she was looking for. Years ago, a building collapsed after a suspicious fire. Dozens lost everything. Some lost their lives. Ethan walked away richer, cleaner, untouched, or so he thought. It had started as just another acquisition. One of many projects Ethan Vance pursued with calculated precision. The building sat in a part of the city most investors ignored: old infrastructure, long-term tenants, complicated ownership. To others, it looked like risk. To Ethan, it looked like opportunity. The kind of opportunity that required patience, pressure, and the ability to see outcomes long before they became visible to anyone else. He had studied it carefully, mapped out every possibility, every obstacle, every resistance point. And at the center of it all were the people who refused to leave, the ones who held onto that place not as property, but as home. Negotiations stretched for months. Offers were made, rejected, increased, and rejected again. Some tenants agreed to leave, but others didn't. They resisted quietly, firmly, unwilling to let go of something that meant more to them than money. Ethan understood that kind of resistance, but he didn't accommodate it. He worked around it: legal pressure, structural reports, safety concerns raised at just the right time. The process was slow, but it was moving in the direction he needed. Until the night everything changed. The fire didn't begin as a headline. It began as a call: late, urgent, unexpected. By the time emergency crews arrived, the damage had already spread beyond control. Flames moved faster than anyone anticipated, feeding on old wiring and aging materials, turning the building into something unstable, unpredictable. The collapse came hours later. Sections of the structure gave way, one after another, until what had stood for decades was reduced to something unrecognizable. The official reports followed quickly: electrical fault, structural weakness, an unfortunate chain of events. It was clean, too clean. Investigations closed faster than expected. Liability shifted away from where it might have complicated things. Insurance claims moved forward. And in the aftermath, the land became available in a way it never had been before. Ethan stepped in, not as the cause, not as the focus, but as the solution. Development plans were approved. Construction began. Within a year, the site that once held that building had been transformed into something entirely different, something profitable, something that fit perfectly into the future Ethan had already planned. He didn't attend any of the memorials. He didn't involve himself in the personal losses that followed. That wasn't his role. It never had been. In his world, events were measured by outcomes, not by the cost behind them. And the outcome, from a business perspective, had been undeniable. The project succeeded. The returns exceeded expectations. His influence expanded. His name carried more weight than before. And whatever questions had existed in the immediate aftermath of the fire faded with time, replaced by new developments, new stories, new priorities. The past settled into silence, filed away in records that no one had reason to revisit. But silence doesn't erase what happened, it only delays it. As Ethan stood in his office now, years removed from that night, the connection began to form in a way he could no longer ignore. Lila Moreno, the woman with no past beyond 6 months, the woman who appeared in his hallway at exactly 2:17 in the morning, reaching into a hidden part of his house as if she knew what it held. The woman who carried bruises on her wrist but said nothing about them. The woman who looked at him with recognition, not fear. That look meant something. It always had. And now, with the fire being reopened, with questions surfacing again after so many years, it began to take on a different weight. Because recognition doesn't come from distance. It comes from connection. And if Lila Moreno was connected to that night in any way, if her presence in his house had anything to do with what happened after the fire, then everything he thought had been settled was. The building, the collapse, the people who lost everything, the ones who didn't make it out, those weren't just events buried in the past anymore. They were part of something that had found its way back into his life, not through official channels, not through legal notices or public investigations, but through something far more direct. Through a person who had stepped into his world quietly, patiently, and with a purpose he was only beginning to understand. Ethan Vance had built his life on the belief that the past could be managed, controlled, reshaped into something that no longer held power over the present. But as the pieces began to align, the fire, the investigation, the hidden shelf, and Lila Moreno standing at 2:17 in the morning reaching for something she believed was there, one truth became harder to ignore. He hadn't walked away from that night as untouched as he believed. He had just never seen what followed him out. That night he waited, 2:17 a.m. Right on time she appeared again, same spot, same movement, but this time he stepped closer. "What are you looking for?" he asked. She froze, then slowly turned. Tears filled her eyes. For a moment neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavier than anything that had come before, because this time there was no distance, no screen, no observation from the shadows. This time, Ethan Vance was standing directly in front of Lila Moreno, close enough to see the truth she had been holding back, close enough to see that whatever brought her here had nothing to do with cleaning, nothing to do with routine, and everything to do with something she had carried into this house long before he ever noticed her. Her hand instinctively moved to her stomach, not in fear, but in protection, as if the life she carried was tied to the moment unfolding in front of her. The bruises on her wrist were clearer now than ever, darker under the hallway light, impossible to ignore, but Ethan's attention stayed on her face, because the tears in her eyes didn't come from being caught. They came from something deeper, something that had been building long before this confrontation. The same look he saw at 2:17 that first night returned, but this time it wasn't controlled. It wasn't restrained. It was exposed. Recognition. Not of a stranger, not of an employer, but of someone she had been searching for in a way he still didn't fully understand. "You already know," she said quietly, her voice breaking just enough to reveal the weight behind it. It wasn't an answer. It was an accusation without force, a statement that suggested the truth had been there all along, waiting for him to see it. Ethan frowned slightly, his mind moving quickly, connecting everything he had learned, the missing past, the repeated visits, the hidden shelf, the reopened case, the fire. "Then say it," he replied, his tone steady, though something beneath it had shifted. Control was still there, but it wasn't as firm as it had been before. Not with her standing in front of him like this, not with the past pressing closer than it ever had. Lila Moreno let out a slow breath, her eyes dropping briefly before returning to his. "It's not supposed to be empty," she said. The words landed quietly, but they changed everything. Ethan's gaze moved instinctively toward the shelf behind her, the same hidden section she had returned to every night at 2:00, the same place she had reached for at exactly 2:17 when he first saw her. "What is?" he asked. "Whatever was left here," she said, her voice steadier now, as if saying it out loud gave her something to hold onto. It was supposed to still be here. Ethan's expression hardened slightly, not from anger but from realization, because that answer confirmed what he had begun to suspect but hadn't fully accepted. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't searching randomly. She had come here with a purpose, with information that told her something existed behind that shelf, something specific, something important enough to bring her back every night despite failure, despite pain, despite whatever had left those marks on her wrist. "Who told you that?" he asked, his voice quieter now, more focused than before. She hesitated, and for the first time since he stepped closer, there was a flicker of uncertainty in her expression. Not fear of him, but of the answer itself. "I didn't come here to explain everything," she said, almost as if she was reminding herself of that. "I came to find something." Her eyes moved again briefly to the shelf, and Ethan followed that glance, seeing it differently now. Not just as a hidden part of his house, not just as a detail from his past, but as something that had become the center of everything happening now. The fire, the investigation, her presence, all of it pointed back to that one place. "And if it's not there?" Ethan asked. The question came out before he could stop it, not as a challenge but as something closer to curiosity. Lila Moreno looked back at him, the tears still in her eyes. But something else beneath them now, determination. "Then someone took it," she said. The answer was simple, direct, and it carried an implication that neither of them could ignore. Because if something had been there, something connected to the past Ethan had buried, something important enough for her to risk everything to find, then its absence meant one thing. Someone else had been there before her. The realization settled between them, heavy and undeniable. Ethan Vance felt it immediately, the shift from uncertainty to something sharper, more dangerous. This wasn't just about what Lila Moreno was searching for anymore. It was about who had taken it, who knew about it, and how far this situation extended beyond what he could see. Because if the hidden shelf had once held something connected to the fire, something that never made it into official records, then its disappearance wasn't an accident. It was a move, a deliberate one. And as Ethan stood there at exactly 2:17 in the morning, facing the one person who had brought all of this back into his life, one truth became impossible to ignore. Lila Moreno wasn't the only one searching. She was just the only one who hadn't found it yet. "You don't remember me," she whispered. Ethan said nothing. "You burned it down," she said, his chest tight. "That building, my family lived there." Silence. "And this child," she placed a hand on her stomach, "is the only thing I have left." The words didn't come out with anger. They came out steady, almost fragile, as if they had been carried for so long that releasing them now felt heavier than holding them in. Ethan Vance didn't interrupt. He didn't deny it. He didn't step back. He stood there, listening, while something he had buried years ago forced its way back into the present with a clarity he couldn't ignore. Lila Moreno's eyes stayed on him, searching his face for something, recognition, guilt, anything that proved she wasn't standing in front of a stranger. But Ethan's silence gave her nothing. Not because he didn't understand what she was saying, but because the memory she was forcing into the open wasn't one he had ever attached to faces. To him, the fire had been an event, a situation, a turning point in business. It had never been personal, not in the way she was describing it now. Not in the way that connected it to a family, to a home, to a life that existed inside that building before it collapsed. "You don't remember the people," she continued, her voice trembling slightly now, though she tried to steady it. "You remember the deal, the outcome, the profit." She swallowed, her grip tightening slightly against her stomach. "But we were there, my father, my mother, my brother. We were inside that building when everything started." Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly, the only visible sign that her words were reaching something deeper than he was willing to show. Because what she was saying wasn't something he could dismiss as assumption or accusation. It aligned too closely with what he already knew. The timing, the location, the fire that had cleared everything in a way no negotiation ever could. "I didn't start that fire," Ethan said finally, his voice low, controlled, but not as firm as it had been before. It wasn't a denial built on certainty. It was a statement built on what he had always believed to be true: the official reports, the conclusions that had closed the case, the version of events he had accepted because it allowed everything else to move forward. But standing there now, at 2:17 in the morning, with Lila Moreno in front of him, with the past resurfacing in ways he hadn't expected, that certainty didn't feel as solid as it once had. Lila shook her head slightly, not in disagreement but in quiet disbelief. "Maybe you didn't light the match," she said, her voice softer now but more direct, "but everything you set in motion led to it." The words settled heavily, not because they accused him directly, but because they forced him to consider something he had never fully examined: the pressure, the inspections, the timing of events that had pushed that building closer to collapse long before the fire ever started. Ethan had always seen those actions as strategy, necessary steps toward an outcome, but hearing it from her, standing there with nothing left except the child she carried, those same actions felt different. They felt connected in a way he had never allowed himself to see. Her eyes dropped briefly, and when she spoke again, her voice carried something deeper than before, not just pain but loss. "We didn't all make it out," she said. The words were simple, but they carried more weight than anything else she had said. Ethan felt it immediately, the shift from accusation to reality. This wasn't about blame anymore. It was about consequence, real people, real lives, and the fact that he had never once asked who they were. "My father," she paused, her voice tightening as she forced herself to continue. "He went back in to get something. I don't even know what, maybe documents, maybe something he thought mattered." She shook her head slightly. "He didn't come out." The silence that followed was heavier than before, filled with everything she didn't say, everything she didn't need to. Ethan didn't look away this time. He held her gaze, even as the weight of what she was saying settled deeper than anything he had felt in years. "And my mother," she continued, her voice quieter now, as if each word required more effort than the last. "She lost everything that night, not just the building, not just the home, everything." Her hand pressed slightly against her stomach again, grounding herself before she finished. "She didn't last long after that." Ethan's chest tightened again, not from the words themselves, but from what they meant. Because for the first time, the fire wasn't just a closed case or a distant event. It was a chain of consequences that had led directly to the person standing in front of him. "And now it's just me," Lila said finally, her voice steadying again, though the emotion behind it hadn't faded. "Me and this child." She looked down briefly, then back up at him. "And the truth." That word lingered longer than the rest. Truth, not accusation, not revenge, truth. And suddenly everything else began to align in a way that made it impossible to ignore. The hidden shelf, the repeated visits, the missing item she believed had been there, the reopened case. None of it was random. None of it was separate. It was all connected to that night, to what happened before the fire, during it, and after it. Ethan Vance stood there silent, not because he had nothing to say, but because for the first time the version of events he had lived with for years didn't feel complete. Lila Moreno hadn't come into his house by accident. She hadn't been searching blindly. She had come with purpose, with knowledge, with a connection to something he had never fully understood. And the look she gave him at 2:17 that first night, the recognition that unsettled him, finally made sense. She wasn't recognizing a stranger. She was looking at the man whose decisions had changed her life forever. And now, standing in front of him, with nothing left except the child she carried and the truth she refused to let go of, she had brought that past back into his world in a way he could no longer control. But she wasn't there for revenge. She was there for truth, because someone else started that fire and framed Ethan. The words didn't come out loudly. They didn't need to. They settled into the space between them with a quiet certainty that changed everything Ethan Vance thought he understood. For a moment, he said nothing, his expression unreadable, but something behind it shifted, because this wasn't just an accusation anymore. It wasn't just about the past catching up to him. It was about the possibility that the past had never been what it seemed in the first place. Lila Moreno held his gaze, steady despite the weight of what she had just said. "I didn't come here to destroy you," she continued, her voice controlled, though the emotion beneath it remained. If I wanted that, I wouldn't be standing here talking to you." Her hand rested against her stomach again, grounding herself, reminding both of them what was at stake beyond this moment. "I came because there's something you do know, something they made sure you never found out." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in disbelief, but in focus. Because if there was one thing he understood better than anyone, it was manipulation. The careful shaping of information, the control of narratives, the way truth could be redirected until it served a different purpose. And if what she was saying was real, then he hadn't just benefited from the fire. He had been positioned by it. "Who?" he asked, his voice low, direct. Lila hesitated for a brief second. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because saying it out loud would change everything. "Someone close to you," she said finally. The answer was simple, but it carried implications Ethan couldn't ignore. His mind moved quickly, scanning through years of partnerships, alliances, decisions made in rooms where trust was assumed but never guaranteed. There were very few people who had both the access and the motive to orchestrate something like that. Fewer still who could ensure that the outcome benefited Ethan while keeping him far enough removed from suspicion. And those people weren't strangers. They were the ones who had stood beside him when everything was built. Lila took a slow breath before continuing, her eyes briefly shifting toward the hidden shelf behind her. "My father knew something," she said. "That's why he went back inside that night." Ethan's attention sharpened immediately. "Knew what?" he asked. "I don't have everything," she admitted. "But I know this: he found documents, proof, something about the ownership of that building, something that didn't match what was on record." She looked back at him. "He told my mother earlier that week that something wasn't right. That someone was moving things around before the deal was finalized, changing details, covering tracks." Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, because that aligned with something he hadn't thought about in years. Small inconsistencies he had dismissed at the time because the outcome worked in his favor, delays that didn't make sense, adjustments in documentation that he had assumed were part of the process. He had accepted them because they moved things forward, because they benefited him. But if those changes had been intentional, if they had been part of something larger, then the fire wasn't just an accident that happened at the right time. It was a turning point that had been engineered. "He never got the chance to show anyone what he found," Lila continued, her voice quieter now but steady. "But he told my mother where he was keeping it, somewhere safe, somewhere no one would think to look." Her eyes moved again to the shelf, and Ethan followed that glance without thinking. The same place she had been reaching for at 2:00 a.m. The same place she had tried to access at exactly 2:17 when he first saw her. The same hidden section of his house that wasn't supposed to matter anymore. "He hid it there," Ethan said slowly, the realization forming as he spoke. It wasn't a question, it was a conclusion. Lila nodded slightly. "That's what I believe. That's why I've been coming back every night." She swallowed before continuing. "But it's gone." The weight of that statement settled immediately, because if her father had hidden something there, something connected to the truth behind the fire, and it was no longer there, then someone had taken it. Someone who knew it existed, someone who understood its value, and someone who had moved before either of them realized what it meant. Ethan's mind moved faster now, connecting everything. The reopened case, the missing records, the carefully constructed identity that allowed Lila Moreno to enter his house without raising suspicion. The bruises on her wrist that suggested she wasn't the only one searching. And the timing. Everything pointed to one conclusion. This wasn't just about the past being uncovered. It was about control over what that past revealed. "You're not the only one looking for it," he said quietly. Lila's expression tightened slightly, confirming what he had just said without words. "I know," she replied. "That's why I don't have much time." Ethan took a step back, his thoughts shifting from understanding to action. Because if someone had orchestrated the fire, framed him without his knowledge, and removed the one piece of evidence that could expose the truth, then this wasn't over. It had never been over. It had just been waiting. He looked at her again, really looked this time, not as an employee, not as an intruder, but as someone who had been pulled into the same situation from a different side. Lila Moreno hadn't come into his life to destroy him. She had come because she was searching for the same thing he now realized he needed. The truth. Not the version that had been filed away years ago, not the version that had benefited him, but the one that explained why everything had happened the way it did. And as Ethan Vance stood there at 2:17 in the morning, the same time everything had begun to unravel, one realization settled with absolute clarity. He hadn't been the one in control all those years. He had been part of someone else's plan. The real enemy, his closest business partner, the one man he trusted, the one man now trying to silence her. The realization didn't come as a sudden shock. It settled in slowly, piece by piece, until there was no other explanation left that made sense. Ethan Vance stood still, his eyes fixed for a moment on the hidden shelf, the same place Lila Moreno had returned to every night at 2:00 a.m., the same place she had reached for at exactly 2:17 when everything began to unravel. That shelf wasn't just a hiding place anymore. It was a connection point, between the past and the present, between the fire and the truth, and between him and the one person who had been close enough to orchestrate everything without ever being questioned. Daniel Mercer, Ethan said quietly. The name didn't need emphasis. It carried its own weight, years of partnership, deals built together, trust that had never been broken, at least not in a way that was visible. Daniel had been there through everything, through the acquisition, through the aftermath of the fire, through the expansion that followed. If there was anyone who had access to the details, the documents, the inconsistencies that Lila's father might have discovered, it was him. And more importantly, Daniel had the ability to reshape those details, to move things quietly, to ensure that whatever truth existed never reached the surface. Lila didn't look surprised when Ethan said the name. That told him everything he needed to know. You already suspected it, he said, more to confirm than to ask. She nodded slightly, her expression tightening as if the confirmation made things heavier, not lighter. I didn't have proof, she replied, but I had enough to know it wasn't random. Her hand moved again to her wrist, briefly touching the bruises as if they were part of the explanation. Ethan noticed it immediately. This time he didn't ignore it. He's been to you, Ethan said, his voice lower now, sharper. It wasn't a question. Lila hesitated, but only for a second. Not directly, she said, but the people working for him have. The answer was enough. Ethan's expression hardened, not with anger but with clarity, because that confirmed what he had already begun to understand. This wasn't just about something that happened years ago. It was active, ongoing. Daniel Mercer hadn't just orchestrated events in the past. He was still controlling the present, still moving pieces into place, still making sure that anyone who got too close to the truth didn't stay close for long. He knew you'd come here, Ethan said, his mind moving quickly now, aligning everything with precision. That's why the file is gone. Lila nodded again, her voice quieter now. I think he's been watching me since I started looking into it. I just didn't know how closely. Ethan let out a slow breath, the weight of that settling in. Because if Daniel Mercer had been watching Lila Moreno, if he had known she was searching for something connected to the fire, then placing her inside Ethan's house wasn't just coincidence. It was strategy, either to monitor her or to lead her somewhere he could control. Ethan glanced briefly toward the hallway behind them, the silence of the house suddenly feeling different, no longer neutral, no longer safe. He's ahead of us, he said quietly. Lila's expression didn't change, but the tension in her posture did. Then we're running out of time, she replied. The simplicity of her answer carried urgency that didn't need to be explained. Because if Daniel Mercer had already removed whatever was hidden behind that shelf, if he had already taken the one piece of evidence that connected him to the fire, then the only thing left to control was the people who knew about it. Ethan's thoughts shifted instantly to the implications. The reopened case, the quiet investigation, the missing documents, Lila Moreno standing in his house at 2:17 in the morning, searching for something that was no longer there. None of it was separate. It was all part of the same sequence, a sequence Daniel had been managing from the beginning. and Ethan had been in the center of it without realizing it, benefiting from outcomes that had been arranged long before he understood the full picture. "He used me," Ethan said, more to himself than to her. The realization wasn't emotional. It was precise. Daniel Mercer had positioned him perfectly, as the face of the deal, as the man who would benefit publicly, as the one who would carry the outcome without questioning the process behind it. And in doing so, Daniel had ensured two things. The fire would clear the way, and Ethan would never look back closely enough to see what had really happened. Lila stepped slightly closer, her voice steady despite everything. "You weren't supposed to find out," she said. "Neither was I." Ethan looked at her again, seeing the situation clearly now, not as two separate paths but as one. She had been pulled into it because of her past. He had been pulled into it because of his position. Different reasons. Same outcome. Both of them standing here now with pieces of a truth that someone else had tried to keep buried. "And now he knows we're both here," Ethan said. The statement didn't need confirmation. It was already understood. Lila's eyes shifted briefly, not in fear but in awareness. "Then he's not going to wait," she replied. The implication was clear. Whatever Daniel Mercer had planned next, it wouldn't involve giving them time to figure things out. It would involve ending the problem before it grew any further. Ethan Vance stood still for a moment, the silence around them heavier than before, filled with everything that had been uncovered and everything that was still hidden. The system he had built, the control he had trusted, the certainty he had lived by, all of it had been compromised in ways he hadn't seen. And at the center of it all was one man. Not a stranger, not an outsider, but the one person he had trusted without question. And as that truth settled fully, one final realization became impossible to ignore. This was never just about the fire. It was about the man who made sure it would never be traced back to him. Ethan stood there, watching everything collapse. Not his empire, not his wealth, but his illusion. For the first time, he wasn't in control. The realization didn't come with noise or chaos. It came quietly, settling into him with a weight he couldn't push away. For years, Ethan Vance had believed that control was something you built, something you maintained through precision, through distance, through never letting anything get close enough to disrupt it. But standing there at exactly 2:17 in the morning, in the same hallway where everything began, he understood something he had never allowed himself to see. Control wasn't something he had. It was something he had been given the illusion of, by someone who understood him better than he understood himself. His eyes moved slowly from the hidden shelf to Lila Moreno, taking in everything that had led to this moment. The woman who had walked into his house with no past. The woman who returned every night at 2:00 a.m., searching for something she believed could change everything. The woman who looked at him with recognition before he ever understood why. And now, the woman standing in front of him with nothing left except the truth she refused to let disappear. She hadn't come for revenge. She hadn't come to destroy him. She had come because what was taken from her demanded to be found, no matter the cost. And in doing that, she had uncovered something far bigger than either of them expected. Ethan let out a slow breath, his mind no longer racing for control but aligning with clarity. Daniel Mercer. The name sat differently now, stripped of trust, stripped of history, revealed for what it truly was. Not a partner, not an ally, but the architect of everything that had unfolded. The fire, the deal, the missing evidence. The quiet manipulation that placed Ethan at the center of it all while keeping the truth just out of reach. It wasn't just betrayal, it was design. A plan executed over years, with patience, with precision, with the understanding that the best way to hide the truth was to bury it beneath success. "And now?" Lila asked softly, her voice breaking the silence just enough to bring him back to the present. Ethan didn't answer immediately, because the question wasn't simple. It wasn't about what came next in a business sense, or how to regain control of a situation that had already slipped beyond it. It was about choice, something he rarely based decisions on. For the first time, the outcome wasn't just about strategy. It was about consequence. About what had been done, what had been lost, and what still remained. He looked at her again, not as an employee, not as a problem to solve, but as someone who had been forced into the same reality from a different side. "Now," he said finally, his voice steady but different from before, "we stop him." The words weren't loud. They didn't carry the authority he usually spoke with, but they carried something else, something more grounded, more real, because this wasn't about maintaining power anymore. It was about uncovering the truth that had been hidden long before either of them stood in this hallway. Lila held his gaze, searching for doubt, for hesitation, for anything that suggested he would step back when things became difficult. But she didn't find it, not this time, because whatever illusion Ethan Vance had been holding onto had already broken, and there was nothing left to protect him from what came next. "He's not going to make it easy," she said quietly. Ethan gave a slight nod, his expression focused now, no longer uncertain. "He never did," he replied. The house around them remained silent, unchanged on the surface, but everything within it had shifted. The system he had built no longer felt absolute. The walls no longer felt secure. Because for the first time, Ethan understood that the greatest threat had never come from outside. It had been beside him all along, watching, waiting, controlling the outcome from a distance he had never questioned. And now that distance was gone. As the clock moved past 2:17, the moment that had started it all began to fade, but its impact didn't. Because what had been uncovered in that hour wasn't just the truth about the fire. It wasn't just the identity of the man behind it. It was something deeper, something Ethan Vance had never faced before. The reality that everything he built, everything he believed he controlled, had been shaped by someone else. And for the first time in his life, he was stepping into a future where control didn't exist. Only truth. Sometimes the past doesn't come back to haunt you. It comes back to expose you. And as Ethan Vance stood there in that hallway, the same hallway where at exactly 2:17 in the morning everything had begun to unravel, he understood the difference. Haunting was distant. It lived in memory, in regret, in things you could choose to ignore if you buried them deep enough. But exposure was something else entirely. It didn't stay in the past. It stepped into your present. It stood in front of you. It spoke your name. It forced you to look at everything you had built and ask one question you could no longer avoid. What was it built on? His eyes moved once more to the hidden shelf, the place Lila Moreno had returned to every night at 2:00 a.m., the place she believed held the truth, the place that had once contained something important enough for her father to risk everything. That empty space meant more now than anything that had ever been hidden there, because it proved that the truth had existed. It had been real. It had been close enough to touch. And someone had taken it, not to protect Ethan, but to protect themselves. Daniel Mercer hadn't just hidden the truth. He had controlled who would carry the consequences of it. Ethan let that settle, not resisting it this time, not reshaping it into something easier to accept. For years, he had lived with outcomes, never questioning the process behind them as long as they worked in his favor. But standing here now, with Lila Moreno beside him, with the past no longer distant but present and undeniable, he saw it clearly. The fire hadn't just changed her life. It had defined his, not by what he lost, but by what he gained. And that difference was something he could no longer ignore. Lila shifted slightly beside him, her hand resting again on her stomach, grounding herself in a future that still existed despite everything that had been taken from her. She didn't speak this time. She didn't need to, because the truth wasn't something that needed repeating anymore. It was already there, in the silence, in the space between them, in the weight of everything that had been uncovered. Ethan glanced at her briefly, then back at the shelf, then forward again, as if finally seeing the full picture without anything blocking it. "Exposure changes everything," he said quietly, more to himself than to her, because it did. It removed distance. It removed control. It removed the ability to pretend that what happened before no longer mattered. And in its place, it left something far more difficult to navigate: responsibility, not just for what he had done, but for what he had allowed by not questioning it sooner. The house remained still, the same structure, the same walls, the same system that once felt untouchable. But Ethan Vance no longer saw it the same way, because control had never truly lived in the walls or the cameras or the systems he built. It had lived in the belief that nothing could reach him if he stayed far enough removed, and now that belief was gone. What remained was the truth. And as the moment settled into silence once more, one thing became clear in a way it never had before. The past hadn't followed him to destroy him. It had found him to reveal who he really was. If you were in his position, would you believe her or protect yourself? Because standing there at exactly 2:17 in the morning, with Lila Moreno in front of him, with the truth unraveling piece by piece, Ethan Vance faced a choice that had nothing to do with power, nothing to do with control, and everything to do with who he really was beneath the empire he built. Would you stand with someone who walked into your life carrying a past you tried to forget? Or would you protect everything you've built, even if it meant turning away from the truth? And tell me, have you ever trusted someone completely, only to realize they were the one person who had been shaping everything behind your back? The one person you never questioned? The one mistake you never saw coming? Because sometimes the biggest betrayals don't come from enemies. They come from the people you chose to trust. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.